So what's the first thing you need to do if you're trying to transform a soccer mom SUV like this into something off-road capable? Step one should really be tires. You know, a mud terrain like this is a lot better off-road than your street tires. I've also stepped up to a bigger tire. A bigger tire makes each obstacle a little bit smaller. So we have a 32-inch mud terrain that's already on this. If you notice from our winter beater series, these have been on it for a minute. The downside to putting a bigger tire on something on stock suspension like this is we can't cycle the full travel. When you get near full bump, the tire's grabbing the inner fender here. So we want to alleviate that with the lift kit I've already designed. Before we design anything to alter the suspension or modify it in any way, we really need to wrap our head around what we have to work with and what the constraints are. The rear suspension on the E53 is kind of typical complicated German multi-link. The spring and airbag, depending on which model you have, mount to the spindle itself. So the most important thing we need to keep in mind is motion ratio. So the motion ratio is, how much each suspension component moves per a certain amount of wheel travel. So because the spring mounts to the spindle, which holds the wheel, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. So for every inch of travel the wheel makes, the spring also makes an inch of travel. The motion ratio on the rear shock is completely different. You can see the 2 pivot points here, and the shock is mounted a portion of the way down the control arm. That means that for every inch of wheel travel, the shock travels a percentage less. So we can measure that, figure out the motion ratio, and know how much we need to change the shock mount. Jesus. Come in. The next major concern we're going to have is clearance between the axle and spindle here. Stock, there's plenty of space, but as we get to droop out more, trying to use full travel, it's going to get very close to that axle. So I want to make sure the shock can't travel too far and allow those two to hit. So here's what I came up with. For the rear spring, whether it be air or traditional coil spring, they both use the same mounting provision. So I made this 1.5 inch spacer, because that's how much lift we're gonna do, which indexes in and uses the stock clip, or fits the factory perch, if you have a spring car. For the shock, remember we talked about motion ratio. This spacer is shorter, and that's on purpose so that it doesn't droop out too far and hit the axle, and it still allows the full travel because of the different motion ratio at the shock mounting position. To design all this stuff, I 3D scanned the stock mounts, so I had something to design off of. You could do it just with measurements, but we have the ability here, and it makes it much easier. So this pattern was pretty easy to come up with. It is not symmetrical. You'll know that if you've worked on one of these, the shock mount only fits one way. So to install the spacer on the upper rear shock mount, we just have to knock the studs out first. So I'm just gonna put it in the vise here and knock those out. They're not in by very much. Then this spacer bolts on in only one direction, which is that one. You see one side's a lot longer than the other two. And then we're gonna thread these bolts in from the bottom. I'm gonna put a little dab of blue Loctite on each of them, and then we can throw it back in the car. So to put this spacer on under the spring, with the airbag cars, there's a little clip underneath that holds the bottom of the airbag to that spindle mount. So we're gonna pull that clip out, then you put it in here and put the clip in through the side, and then this bolts right through the existing hole. If it were a spring car, you could bolt this right in and then put your spring perch in. We have a spring compressing tool because it is kind of hard to compress this spring if it's a coil sprung car in this position. So we make a tool that slips in and can compress it into the body. Since there's no air in the airbag right now, the easiest way to do it is just to tip it over like this. You can index that in. There's a little keying feature there, so it slots right in. You can fit this clip in through the side and then clip it back in place. It'd be cool if it wasn't an Ohio car with an extremely crusty clip. I'm gonna take this bolt back out. I don't know why I threaded it in this much.
I don't want to use it either.
Because I fidget with shit while we're filming. That's what happens. Okay, put the bolt out. Swing this back in. Make sure it keys into the arm, and then fit the bolt in from underneath. Now that we have the puck under the spring, we can just throw the shock right back in and keep moving. So the front suspension on the E53 is kind of a more traditional McPherson setup, where the strut itself holds the wheel up and down, or upright, and then there's a multi-link lower setup with a thrust arm and a control arm. Pretty typical German stuff. So in pursuing an 1.5-inch lift to match the rear, I found that the inner CV joint binds if you try to just make a spacer that's 1.5 inches. So that's not an option. What I came up with was kind of splitting the difference. I made a spacer for the top that isn't as tall, and that gives you more droop in the suspension, but not so much that it binds the inner CV joint. And I made a different spring perch that compresses this spring a little bit more. So that changes where ride height is in shock travel. Not so much that you have no down travel, but enough to make up the difference between. All right, I thought I'd show you a couple things that we're doing on screen here. So I have, the scan data I took of the actual mounts for the lift kit. Sure, you could just do this with hand measurements, but we have the scanner. It's faster and easier for me to just scan the thing and actually throw it in the model. This is my lift spacer on top of the factory front shock mount. You can kind of see it is nice to be able to just throw it in here. The pattern is easy to figure out because I can just create features off of it. And then I made sure the dowel fits into one of the holes for the studs. It gives me an idea how long the studs need to be. So pretty straightforward, very simple. We were able to throw the logos in, do all that. Rear mount, same deal. So very simple. This is the one that we throw bolts through the whole thing. We actually knock the studs out of the stock mount. This is not enough space to actually clock it off of itself to put new studs in. So it seemed like the easiest way to do it. And then I don't have scan data of the other stuff, but this is the rear spring spacer. Works for both airbag and non-airbag cars. You see the keying feature that replicates the bag and gives you guys space for the clip for the airbag. Once you do reinstall that. Pretty easy there. And in testing, I figured out that we had to split the front spacer up into on top of the shock mount and then a coil spacer as well. That's because at full droop, the axle is binding, and we don't want that. I want this to be used hard and not break parts, other than whatever you might do on your own. In order to do that, I had to split it up and control droop with that upper spacer so it doesn't droop too far and bind up the axle, and then get the rest of the lift out with a different front spring perch, which is what this guy is. So, very easy. Now we'll go install it. So the new spring perch pilots right on the thrust bearing there, clips right in nice. Then my my spring pad is still in the spring here, so it's just as easy as reassembling. Remember, you're not supposed to use air tools on spring compressors. Okay, that is just a simple thing to bolt on this spacer. The little nub here doesn't have to be removed. It falls right into the counter bore for the stud. And the pattern is symmetrical, so you can put this on whichever way you want. Click. I like to line up the studs just looking at it before I try to muscle it in there. Saves you a little time struggling with it, but it's as easy as throwing the strut back in the vehicle. The strut towers on these have slots already. That little nub would hold it with the factory shock mount, but since that's not here, we now have access to this adjustment. So because we're lifting it, these tend to get a little towards positive camber when they're lifted. So I'm gonna slide it all the way in. Try to get as much negative as I can out of this. The last step we're doing here is really only for the air ride cars. There's a little sensor here that tells the air ride system how much pressure to put in the bags to set ride height. Even with the lift kit, it's gonna go right back to where it was. So we have longer replacement links to put in there and get the car to our lift kit. The arms on these sensors are super fragile, especially with old age. So it's really nice to, like, you really have to support them to make sure you don't break it when you pop the factory arm off. So I just grab it with a pair of needle nose to support it and then pry it off the little ball. But the new ones are a little bit easier to install. They're a little bit softer. So you just clip these on with your fingers. While the front suspension's apart, I'm gonna install a set of monoballs. The factory bushings have a lot of compliance for street use and aren't really intended for the impacts of off-roading and cycling full travel. So I'm gonna replace them with the monoball spherical bearings here. There's really not much increase in MVH. It's a much more direct steering feel and braking feel. You can buy them pre-pressed in, or like what we're doing is pressing them in ourselves. That's what that big kabang was, just breaking the rust free. Now, normally you'd never tighten a bushing like this, but because it's a spherical bearing, it doesn't preload it at all. If it was a bushing, we gotta, like, even just with the lift kit, because it's gonna be taller, you'd wanna loosen all these and tighten them again at ride height, so the bushing has natural motion in either direction. So I don't really like how these look on E34s, so they sat in my basement for like 2 years. Then I bought this thing. I was like, perfect. I can think, like, this was designed, if it came out in 2000, the car was really designed and sculpted probably mid to late 90s. So that time period of this wheel makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Remember, I'm actually gonna design a part you guys suggest. It has to be a good idea, but comment below with what you think we should make for this X5. So we're doing the alignment on the X5, something that's a necessity after you change this many parts and change the ride height like this. So I'm just setting everything up. When you have something modified to this extent, factory specs don't necessarily mean a whole lot. You're at a different point in the bump steer curve and it's gonna behave differently. So your best bet is to take it to a shop that does know what they want or look into the specs enough to see what you would like. For me, on this car, I prefer a little less toe in than what they spec. So I'm gonna set it to my preference and we're gonna get this thing outside. So if you remember, you know, some of the intro shots we were doing with this car, I had to hit stuff kind of slow because on a big hit or, you know, a compression event with the suspension, the tire would rub. And I don't want to destroy the tire or rip a fender liner out or something like that. So I had to take it easy, which is not my preferred method of off-roading. I do prefer kind of the speed side of things. I appreciate rock crawling, not really much for the mud. But blasting dirt roads and trails and stuff is definitely a ton of fun. And I like having the assurance that, you know, a hit that you could take with the suspension, you know, the faster you're going, the bigger that hit is. So knowing I have up travel to spare a little bit, I can kind of really beat this thing up. So I can go up this hill climb here, which is a bunch of pretty gnarly rocks. And it really doesn't care, which is great. Ooh, big washout. Suspension feels nice. I still have enough down travel, so I'm still in control. No clunks or weird noises. Suspension's keeping up nice. Those monoballs are making a big difference. Everything feels very crisp and direct, but not jarring. Like, I'm not hitting little rocks and boulders here, and you know, it's not grabbing the wheel. It's not, you know, an obtrusive event. It's smooth, direct. I am feeling where I'm going. Braking's much more direct. You're not feeling the compression event of a bushing. So I'm very pleased. This has become a much better driver just from doing the monoballs, never mind the lift. I can actually kind of rip through a lot of this stuff now, which is a lot more fun. And you can see, cover a lot more ground, explore everything a lot faster and sooner. I can't see why you wouldn't want to be able to do more speed. I'm gonna pick Grant up again now. We're gonna get out of here and do some street testing. So the general road impressions of the lift kit, like just kind of playing street car here, which is realistically a large portion of the amount of drive time you're gonna spend in a vehicle like this, is great. Like, you'd think it'd feel a little rollier, and it really doesn't. I'm trucking through this area here, and some windy curves. You can really throw it around. There's still a decent amount of grip. So I can kind of throw this thing into a corner. It'll make some funny tire squeal noises because they're big now. Everything's fine. Runs great. Drives great. No weird noises. Monoballs are great. Braking's a lot more direct. Steering input's a lot more direct. You're not feeling the compression of a bushing. Like, that's one of my biggest pet peeves, is once you figure out what exactly you're looking for, is when you can feel a bushing deforming under the vehicle. It kind of just drives me nuts. Like, it gives you no direct road feel. Makes it feel like a shitty vehicle, in my opinion, when everything's kind of squidgy and moving around. So monoballs are a nice direct, crisp feel, which I was gonna say crisp a million times, but it is. I mean, I don't know what else to describe it as. Braking events are a lot more immediate, but like the increase in NVH really isn't a thing. Like, yeah, you can feel the bumps a little bit more, but only that you feel that they're more direct. It's not an increase in noise, it's just a different noise, in my opinion. Like, I feel the directness of each bump versus like a compression and rebound event of a bushing every time you hit a bump. So to me, it's like half the NVH, just because I feel less movement. Not everyone feels the same way. It's okay to be wrong. Overall package of this is greatly transformed here. Big fan. Still handles awesome as a street car. It is still a performance SUV, kind of in the soccer mom category, and it still fits that bill. It's still really good at that. I'm not sure we're going to be able to take that away anyway. But on top of it, now we've added quite a bit more off-road capability. With more to come. But at the moment, this has been a very large transformation for not that much work. All right, the lift on the X5 has been a huge success. It's still nice and streetable. We have a bunch more up travel for off-road use. We can hit trails a lot faster, and we're not rubbing or having any issues with these tires. I know this is one of those things where basically the product was already designed, but this is the foundation of where we need to go with this project. So next time we're going to dive into a lot more of the design process with some of the things we're going to be upgrading next. Make sure to like and subscribe and follow along. You can follow me at Mike the Day. We'll see you guys next time.